Hello, and welcome once again to Denton's Tales. And this time, I'd like to say something about an aspect of Norse mythology that I'm sure just about everyone on Earth has heard of, even if they don't know much about it, namely the Valkyrie, or the Valkyries, as it is in English. And indeed, there is hardly anything more synonymous in the popular mind with Norse mythology, or indeed the Vikings themselves, than the Valkyrie, the mounted warrior women who took those killed in battle to Ásgarðr, or Asgard, as it's called in English. Yes, the Valkyries, whose romantic and thrilling image, riding across the sky with a fallen warrior slung over their horse, has inspired a plethora of paintings and statues, as well as one of the most famous pieces of classical music ever written, the Valkyrjur, the Ride of the Valkyries, from the start of Act 3 of Richard Wagner's Die Walküre, a great piece of music which, like the Valkyries themselves, is probably well known to just about everyone. Everyone has heard the Ride of the Valkyries, even those who detest classical music and would have to be dragged screaming to an operatic performance. They will still know this piece of music. They will have heard it even if they cover their ears and wish they were dead when they hear it. It was, of course, Wagner who was also, indirectly, I suppose, responsible for these women being shown with wings on their helmets. Wings that would not have looked out of place on a large bird like a swan or a condor, something that was never mentioned nor depicted in any way in ancient times. Valkyries are mentioned in the sagas and the poems as wearing helmets right enough, and burnies, as well as carrying shields, spears, and swords. But wings never come into it, nor do horns on Viking helmets for that matter. Something else we may lay at the feet of Herr Wagner, or rather more correctly on costume designers for his operas, and then later illustrators for those operas. And they began drawing horns on helmets, not just for his operatic characters, but genuine historical figures as well as characters from the Norse sagas. That is where the myth of the Viking horned helmet originated. A helmet they never actually wore, yet it has become synonymous with Vikings. You've only to show someone with a helmet with horns sticking out of it. Ah, Viking! Now, I mean, a genuine Viking helmet would have looked, well, something like this one, either with the double ocular guard or with a single nose guard hanging down. And, you know, with the Viking horned helmet came the winged helmet of the Valkyrie, both products of Victorian Romanticism having no basis whatsoever in history or mythology. Now, horned headdresses were certainly used ceremonially by the warlord. There are illustrations of people wearing these large horned-type headdresses. And warriors, of course, may well have decorated their helmets with feathers or plumes, as medieval knights did too. But horns or wings as integral parts of combat helmets are pure fiction. You know, long horns on a helmet would have been a bit awkward in a shield wall. You know, you duck to one side to avoid a spear thrust, and Eric beside you now has a horn stuck in his ear, which would be, you know, rather inconvenient to say the least. Viking armor, when it was worn, which it usually wasn't, other than by wealthy warriors or the nobles, would normally have been a chainmail coat called a burnie, or even a leather garment, often worn over boiled leather or a padded jerkin that would reach down to the hips, or in some cases the knee, and a helmet, no wings or horns, of course. So a Valkyrie should really be seen as dressed in a mail coat worn over some kind of tunic-like garment and a plain helmet of some type. Before we get into the Valkyrie themselves, I think it's important to take a quick look at how we come to know about them in the first place, because very little of our knowledge of Norse religion or mythology actually comes directly from the time when it forms part of the beliefs of the Norse people. No, we get it in a second-hand form, having been written down often centuries afterwards. Now, the Norse could write. They had a perfectly functional written language had they chosen to use it. First with the so-called Elder Futhark and later the Younger Futhark system of runes. But though the Norse could write, they didn't use the runes to write books. No, they used them for protection on amulets or rings, as decorations, as captions, if you like, on tapestries or paintings, or using them as inscriptions on stone monuments, runestones as they're often called, of which there are a great many across Scandinavia, some of them very elaborate indeed, with inscriptions like Olaf went somewhere and did something when he got there, or in memory of Sigurd, who died somewhere, that sort of thing. But they didn't record their history or their religious beliefs, which of course is a great pity, because that meant that almost everything we know about them comes from second-hand sources. The Norse, or Icelandic sagas as they're called, the stories of gods and the deeds of heroes, were verbal tales. Then they were recounted by men and women called skalds, who were poets and storytellers who would travel around to the halls of the various jarls and chieftains. And there they would recount these wonderful tales, as well, of course, as poems they made up that praised the particular jarl or chieftain in whose hall they happened to be at the time, recounting all his great and wonderful deeds, his outstanding bravery, his many amazing feats of strength, even if he hadn't actually done any. It's always nice to get paid. And the tales would, of course, be told by ordinary people as well, passing the time on a long dark winter's night, perhaps. But most of them weren't actually committed to parchment in a written form until the 13th century, and unfortunately by people who did not share their beliefs. Much of our knowledge of Norse mythology we owe to the prose Edda, written by an Icelandic chieftain, law speaker, historian, politician, and poet named Snorri Sturluson, 1179 to 1241 AD, as well as to another Icelandic work entitled the Codex Regius, or the Royal Book, which dates from around 1270, and from which we get the collected poems and stories that form the Poetic Edda, and as well from the works of the Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus, who lived 1160 to 1220. But as I've said, all of these were written long after the days when the sagas had actually been composed and told by the skalds, hundreds of years in many cases. Stories that had been handed down by word of mouth from generation to generation, and they were written down by Christians. So they have to be seen in the context of pagan stories retold from a Christian viewpoint, admittedly a sympathetic and caring Christian viewpoint. I mean, Snorri, for example, wanted to preserve the traditions of his people and pass on the skills of Norse poetry to future writers. But we can't be sure how much was altered, watered down, or even omitted altogether to make it more palatable to Christians, because the church would have taken a dim view if he had appeared to be too much in praise of anything pagan. So, let us proceed. In Old Norse, they are the Valkyrie, to singular, or the Valkyrie plural, which translates as the chooser or the choosers of the warriors slain in battle, coming from Val, meaning specifically a warrior killed in battle with a weapon in his hand, and Kyria, a feminine form of one who chooses something. Since not only did they bring the dead to Óðinn's hall, Valhåll, which means the hall of the warriors slain in battle, in Ásgarðr, but they were actually responsible for many of them being dead in the first place. But before we come to that, a word about Valhåll. The term Valhalla is incorrect. There is no A on the end, and that name wasn't even used until the 18th century. It's first documented in 1768, in fact. However, the name Valhåll could alter slightly to sound similar to that incorrect version. Perhaps that is even where that version came from, in the genitive case, when preceded by the preposition to, which was till in Old Norse. So in other words, if you said that you wanted to go to Valhåll, the hall will become hal, and it will be till Valhalla. But other than that, it was Valhåll. Also, most people refer to Valhalla as the home of the gods. Yes, the home of the gods, Valhalla, which it is not. Like in the closing scene of Wagner's Das Rheingold, where the gods cross over Bifrost, I should say, the Rainbow Bridge into Valhalla, or Valhåll, as the actually more correct German version happens to be. But Wagner got that completely wrong. They are crossing into Ásgarðr. That is the home of the gods. Valhåll is nothing more than a building. It's just a hall, one of many such halls in Ásgarðr, albeit a very special hall roofed with golden shields, and its very name giving a clue to its actual identity, the hall of the warriors slain in battle. That is all it is. The place in Ásgarðr where the dead warriors go to fight and to feast with the gods, or half of them at least. I'll come to that in a moment. The gods themselves do not live in Valhåll. They just feast and get pissed there on a nightly basis. Different thing altogether. Though I suppose, given the amount of feasting and merrymaking that went on there, pretty much 24/7, they did probably spend quite a lot of their time there, much of it possibly flat on the floor, recovering from a hangover. Now, I've mentioned the responsibility of the Valkyrie for some of the warriors they transported to Valhåll actually being dead. And that is the case, since they could choose who died and who lived. Remember their title. They're not called dead guy collectors. No, they are the choosers of the warriors slain in battle, because that was exactly what they did. They chose. See, before they flew off to the battlefield, Óðinn would tell them who he wanted dead and who should live. Snorri tells us in the Prose Edda how they take the slain and decide fights. Hang on a minute, I hear you say. There's something not quite right about that picture. I mean, isn't it, who wins or loses decided by who's the better warrior? Fighting skill, strength, superior weapons, superior numbers, and all that, rather than some woman coming along and doing an eeny, meeny, miny, mo, dead sort of thing? Absolutely correct. It really turned the whole warrior concept upside down, at least in the sagas, if not actually in reality. But there was a reason for it. Let's say in a saga that Olaf the Awful has practiced all his life. That's all he does, day and night. Train and sleep, train and sleep, training and sleeping, until he's become the greatest warrior ever known, feared by all, totally invincible in battle. Even the greatest of warriors fall before him like so much chaff. And then he comes up against Eric the Useless. Yes, the sort of warrior who draws his sword and promptly drops it. Now, he's just about to skewer Eric, who is now cowering on the ground, even more useless than he normally is. The fight is over, and Olaf is the clear winner. But suddenly, some woman, not wearing a winged helmet, rides down out of the sky and says, "No, you can't do that, Olaf. He is useless, and All-Father has no use for him, so sorry about this. You're dead." And she freezes his sword arm, so Eric jumps up and kills him. And of course, should Eric the Useless be so useless he can't even manage that by himself, well, she'll kill Olaf herself. In the Heimskringla saga, Óðinn sends two Valkyrjur, Gondor and Skogul, out from Ásgarðr to choose among the kinsmen as to who will die in a coming battle. As a result, King Håkon I of Norway and all his men are killed. And, now being dead, he can see one of the Valkyrie sitting there on her horse, high-hearted on horseback, and leaning on her spear. And he, clearly a bit peeved at the outcome. I mean, he's dead, after all. He asks her rather indignantly why his lot are dead and the other lot won, because he feels his lot were much better warriors and thus more worthy of victory. To which she replies, "It is owing to us that the issue was won and your foemen fled." Or to put it into modern everyday speak, tough shit, our choice, you're dead, and if you don't like that, you can sod off. King Håkon's fighting skills, you see, didn't really get him very far. He was dead even before the battle, you might say. And the end result would have been the same had he been facing a bunch of 10-year-old kids armed with sticks once the Valkyrie arrived on the scene, because he wasn't just fighting his opponents. No, he was fighting Óðinn, or at least he was fighting Óðinn via his messengers, the Valkyrie. The only consolation, of course, was that they were now going to take him and his men up to Ásgarðr to feed in Valhåll, the dream of every Norse warrior. So it worked out pretty well in the end, I suppose. And it was the least they could do. They just bloody well killed everybody, after all. But King Håkon was correct. He and his men were the superior fighters, which was why they, and not the other lot, were now getting that free ride skywards with the Valkyrie. And the lesser warriors, well, they would live to die another day, which, given their lack of ability, probably wouldn't be all that long. Now, it's important to remember that not every dead warrior was taken to Valhåll. Only half of them, in fact, joined Óðinn. The other half went to Sessrumnir, the great hall of the goddess Freyja, depicted here on my shirt. For it was her choice of half of the dead who were brought by the Valkyrie. The other half Óðinn took. We know very little about Cesselnir, save that it was large and beautiful, and it lay in what seems to have been a field or meadow of some kind called Folkvanga. But given the fact that it contained just as many dead warriors as did Valhåll, half the total number, it must have been of a similar size. The at first curious seeming method of deciding who lived and who didn't, great warriors killed by inferior ones, stemmed from Odin's desire to have the greatest warriors in his army of the dead, ready to fight for him in the mighty battle that will bring about the end of the world, Ragnarok. And since he didn't know exactly when that battle might come, he didn't want to have to wait too long to get them. So if he saw a great and skilled, unbeatable warrior going to fight a much inferior one, obviously the inferior one, the one he didn't want, would be killed and get the sky ride with the Valkyrie. So he sent his warrior women to, well, rig the game a bit, you might say, and get him the warrior he actually wanted. A good one. I mean, he could wait for the other kind. They probably wouldn't be much use in a battle anyway. Of course, since Odin is supposed to already know the outcome of Ragnarok, one might wonder why he bothered at all. But that's not for me to say. He did. We see the wishes of Odin with regards to the Valkyrie orders before battle very clearly in the Volsunga saga, where the famous Valkyrie, Brynhild, is punished by him for making a mistake by killing a man who was supposed to win the battle, she ending up in a magic sleep on a hilltop, surrounded by a ring of fire until such time as one brave enough, or perhaps just plain stupid enough, to walk through the flames shall awaken her. Very romantic, of course. Wagner used this tale for the ending scene of the Valkyrie, where Odin, or Wotan as he is in the opera, calls on Loki, Loge, in the German version, "As I found you of old, a wandering flame," he says, and he tells him to surround Brynhild with fire, she being renamed by Wagner as Brynhilde. You know, it should be noted with regard to Wagner's magic fire that Loki wasn't, as commonly believed, the god of fire. He was a trickster, not a pyromaniac. He really had nothing to do with fire. He did not start fires. In fact, he couldn't even have lit a fire in his own hearth without a flint and some kindling. In that, I suppose, he can join the horned and winged helmets as Wagnerian misconceptions. Now, the Valkyrie are often regarded as being the daughters of Odin, but they weren't. In fact, they could be any woman at all who was chosen to serve in that capacity. There was no actual requirement to be blood related to the Allfather himself. Nepotism had no place in Ásgarðr. And reading through the sagas shows quite clearly that they could be both human and non-human, divine or mortal. For example, there was the daughter of a king, another the daughter of a female giant, and another the daughter of the god Thor. But all of them were appointed to the position by Odin himself. The only genuine requirement to join the Valkyrie was to be a woman. That's all you had to be, a woman, and you're in. And there are similar females to be found in the mythology of lands where the Norse traded or settled. For example, the Anglo-Saxons had female spirits of carnage that in Old English they called a very, very similar name, Valkyrie, possibly dating from a time when both the Norse and the early Saxons spoke much the same language. Both were North Germanic peoples, of course, perhaps around the 3rd century AD or so, though we don't really know very much about exactly how the Anglo-Saxons regarded them. And of course, here in Ireland, the war goddess Bav, one of the personifications of the great triple goddess, the Morrigan, would tour the battlefields, using her influence to make the combat go whichever way she desired, much as the Valkyries would, crying out to intimidate the warriors. A number of the Valkyrie are named in various sagas and poems, and many of their names, not really surprisingly, I suppose, are related to aspects of combat. Brynhild, the most famous of all the Valkyrie, her name means battle armor. Sigrun is victory rune. Hildur, or Hild, a very common name for girls in Scandinavia actually, means battle, and Gudur is war. Other names translate as battle spear, shield destroyer, spear thrower, axe age, spear shaker, sword time, and fight. They're mentioned, as I've said, as having helmets, byrnies, and carrying shields, as well as spears on several occasions in the Poetic Edda, as well as being mounted. And there's a brief reference to Valkyrie putting on what are called swan suits, or swan skins. though there is no indication as to what the actual purpose of these garments was, nor exactly how they were made or even how they were worn. But there is a possibility that whatever they actually were, they had something to do with the Valkyrie ability to fly. When we consider that the goddess Freyja had a cloak called Featherskin, made of hawk feathers, which enabled her to fly, and was borrowed by other gods from time to time when they too needed to fly somewhere. And Freyja may even have been a Valkyrie herself, being mentioned as riding into battle, as well as collecting half of the dead warriors herself and taking them to her own hall in Ásgarðr. So it could be that the swan feathers did the same for the Valkyrie that hawk feathers did for Freyja. Though we simply have no definite answer to that, but it certainly seems more than a possibility. You know, both have feathers. She has hawk feathers, they have swan suits. They both fly. Birds can fly because they have feathers. So there seems more than enough evidence to make that a distinct possibility. It is also possible that some of their powers actually came from these suits, because in a poem that has come down to us in the Codex Regius, some men come across 3 women sitting beside a lake one morning, and beside them are their swan skins, as they're called. And these women are Valkyrjur. The men decide to take the skins and get the women to be with them for a number of years. They really kidnap them, I suppose you could say. After which they will reclaim their skins and return to being Valkyrie, which suggests that some ability must have come from those skins or suits, since they had to get them back to retain their status. Rather strangely, their absence doesn't seem to have been noticed, since Óðinn doesn't send anyone to find out where they are or try to get them back. Now, as to whether these swan suits were donned by the Valkyrie over or under their armour, I have no idea, but given one mention in a poem of them having their byrnies covered in blood, it would seem likely they were worn under it, though again we really have no actual indication as to the type of garments these suits or skins were. Were they put on like a tunic? Were they some kind of wraparound garment, like a cloak? In fact, a cloak does seem quite likely. There is no mention, by the way, of their horses having wings, though artists sometimes draw them that way, like a Nordic version of Pegasus. And the Marvel movie, oh dear, the Marvel movies. Yes, a Marvel movie actually had all the Valkyrie riding on winged horses. But then that was Marvel, not exactly famous for accuracy. That is known, you see, as artistic license, or in other words, completely forget the actual facts and draw the first thing you think of. Also, they do appear to have possessed some degree of invisibility, though that is not actually ever stated as such. But given the fact that they could go around battlefields, choosing who died and who didn't, yet they were almost never seen by the combatants, other than the dead ones, of course, which seems to indicate that they could shield themselves somehow from mortal eyes. Now, you know, that would make sense, I suppose, since it would be highly distracting if one was, fighting while helmeted women carrying spears were wandering around on the battlefield, muttering, "Eric, great warrior, you die. Sven, powerful with an axe, you die. Sigurd, you're useless, you live. Thorfinn, you kill everyone you fight, you die. Olaf, you couldn't kill a geriatric chicken if it lay down and surrendered, you live." They could really distract the warriors, which might result in the wrong man being killed, and that would piss off all farther sitting back up in Ásgarðr. In that case, they might all find themselves sleeping peacefully on a hilltop, surrounded by a magic fire, waiting for some heroic idiot to run through it and kiss them. Like that's going to happen anytime soon. Apart from their flying ability, which may or may not have been due to the swan suits, or just been their horses that could fly, and some invisibility, they don't seem to have possessed any other special attributes. They did not have magic as such, nor is there any indication if they had immortality, which, since some of them were human, would seem unlikely, unless they received it as a gift from Óðinn or were permitted to have some of Idunn's youth-giving apples, but there's no actual mention of that. If they're going to be around for Ragnarok, one would assume they would need rather longer than the average human lifespan, or will they just be replaced as they grow old? There's really nothing to say either way on that one. In part 2 of this video, I will be looking at a very considerable myth about the Valkyrie. The idea that their duties were simply to bring dead warriors up to Ásgarðr. Oh, that isn't the case. No, indeed. That is not the case by a very long way. But, I'm sorry, it must wait for part 2, among quite a number of other things. So, until then, I shall say farewell. Goodbye for now.